Major General Curtis LeMay stood before his staff officers on March 8, 1945, and announced a decision that violated every principle of strategic bombing doctrine. "We're going in low, 5 to 7,000 feet, at night, and we're stripping the guns." The room fell silent. What LeMay proposed was tactically insane by conventional standards. The B-29 had been designed as a high-altitude precision bomber, protected by remotely controlled gun turrets and the thin air at 30,000 feet, where enemy fighters struggled to operate. Now LeMay wanted to send his crews into the heart of Japanese air defenses, flying lower than medium bombers, in darkness, with most defensive weapons removed. But LeMay had studied the numbers with brutal clarity. Since November 1944, the 21st Bomber Command had flown dozens of high-altitude daylight raids against Japanese industrial targets. Results had been catastrophic, not for Japan, but for American effectiveness. The jet stream scattered bombs across entire prefectures. Cloud cover obscured targets 7 days out of 10. Mechanical failures plagued engines pushed beyond safe limits in the freezing upper atmosphere. Crews returned exhausted, frostbitten, and increasingly demoralized as reconnaissance photos showed their bombs had missed factories by miles. LeMay calculated that precision bombing Japan was operationally impossible. The weather wouldn't cooperate. The distances were too great. The targets were too small and too dispersed among civilian areas. But Japanese cities themselves presented a different kind of target. Vast, densely packed, and constructed almost entirely of wood and paper. Intelligence reports 750,000 people living in 12 square miles of Shitamachi, LeMay told his staff, pointing to maps of Tokyo's working-class district. Wooden homes, narrow streets, no fire breaks. We saturate that area with incendiaries, and physics does the rest. The plan eliminated high-altitude bombing's fundamental problems. Flying low conserved fuel, allowing bombers to carry double their normal ordnance load. Removing defensive guns reduced weight further. Each aircraft could now carry 1,020 M69 napalm bomblets instead of 500-pound general-purpose bombs. Night operations would avoid Japanese fighters that relied on visual identification. And most critically, the mission required no precision whatsoever. The target was the city itself. LeMay knew the moral implications. He later admitted that if America lost the war, he would be tried as a war criminal for what he was about to order. But he also believed the alternative, a ground invasion of Japan, would cost 1 million Allied casualties and possibly 10 million Japanese lives. The Japanese war machine depends on small workshops distributed throughout residential areas. LeMay argued to skeptical subordinates, "We can't bomb 1,000 individual factories, but we can eliminate the districts where those factories operate. We end industrial production by removing the infrastructure that supports it." Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. On March 9th at 17:35 hours, LeMay's gamble began. The first B-29 roared down Guam's Northfield runway, followed by 324 more. Each pilot had received identical orders: fly low, drop fast, and turn Tokyo into an inferno. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the most expensive weapons program in American history, a $3 billion gamble that exceeded even the Manhattan Project's cost. Development had begun in 1940 when the Army Air Corps demanded the impossible: a bomber capable of carrying a 20,000-pound bomb load over 5,000 miles at speeds exceeding 400 mph, operating at altitudes where enemy fighters couldn't reach. Boeing's engineers delivered a machine that redefined what aircraft could accomplish. The B-29 stretched 99 feet from nose to tail with a wingspan of 141 feet, dimensions that dwarfed every bomber previously built. Four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each generating 20,200 horsepower, drove propellers 13 feet in diameter. These power plants represented the cutting edge of piston engine technology, incorporating features like turbo superchargers that maintained power output even at 30,000 feet, where the air contained one-third the oxygen of sea level. But the B-29's revolutionary design went far beyond raw power. The aircraft featured pressurized crew compartments, a first for bombers, allowing crews to operate in shirt sleeves at altitudes where external temperatures plunged to 60 degrees below zero. A tunnel connected the forward cabin to the rear gunner's station, though crawling through it during flight remained a claustrophobic ordeal. The defensive armament system showcased wartime innovation at its peak. Remote-controlled gun turrets mounted throughout the fuselage responded to gunners' commands through a sophisticated analog computer that calculated lead angles, corrected for airspeed, and adjusted for parallax. Each turret carried twin 50-caliber machine guns, while a tail position added a 20mm cannon. The entire system could engage multiple targets simultaneously, theoretically making the B-29 a flying fortress, in truth, rather than just propaganda. What truly shocked Japan wasn't the B-29's capabilities, but America's capacity to produce them in staggering numbers. By March 1945, 4 separate factories operated around the clock, manufacturing superfortresses. Boeing's plants at Seattle, Renton, and Wichita worked in parallel with the Glenn L. Martin Company in Omaha and Bell Aircraft Corporation in Marietta, Georgia. The production statistics revealed industrial might beyond anything the Axis powers could comprehend. Boeing's Wichita facility alone rolled out 4.2 completed B-29s every working day. Each aircraft required 55,000 separate parts manufactured by over 1,500 subcontractors scattered across the United States. Assembly line workers, many of them women who had never worked in factories before Pearl Harbor, riveted aluminum panels, installed hydraulic systems, and calibrated bomb sights with precision that would have been impossible just 5 years earlier. By the night of March 9, 1945, American factories had delivered approximately 2,000 B-29s to combat units, with production accelerating toward the eventual wartime total of 3,970 aircraft. Japan's entire Air Force, by contrast, contained fewer operational aircraft than America was building B-29s each month. The mathematics of industrial warfare had rendered traditional military thinking obsolete. Japan could train elite pilots, employ tactical brilliance, and fight with fanatical determination. But none of it mattered against an enemy that manufactured 4 bombers per day, every day, from factories Japan couldn't reach. Tonight, 325 of those bombers were coming for Tokyo. By March 1945, Japan's air defense system existed largely on paper. The Imperial Japanese Army and Navy maintained separate command structures that refused to coordinate operations, share intelligence, or even communicate effectively. This institutional dysfunction meant that fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft batteries often operated in ignorance of each other's actions, sometimes engaging the same targets while leaving other sectors completely undefended. Japan's night fighter force consisted primarily of 2 aircraft types hastily adapted for a role they were never designed to fill. The Nakajima J-1N1 Gecko, originally built for reconnaissance, had been retrofitted with oblique-firing 20mm cannons that could theoretically attack bombers from below. The Kawasaki Ki-45 Toryu carried a 37mm nose cannon and additional upward-firing guns. Both designs showed ingenuity, but Japan had produced only 479 geckos and 1,701 toryus throughout the entire war, numbers that barely covered losses from normal attrition, let alone combat. More critically, these fighters lacked the technology that made night interception possible. American and British night fighters carried airborne radar that could detect bombers in total darkness from miles away. Japanese aircraft had no such equipment. Pilots relied on searchlights to illuminate targets and visual identification in conditions where seeing anything was nearly impossible. Even when searchlights found a B-29, the bomber's 350 mph speed meant it disappeared from the beam within seconds. Ground defenses fared no better. Tokyo, a metropolitan area housing over 3 million people, was defended by fewer than 500 heavy anti-aircraft guns. The Type 88 75mm gun provided high-altitude coverage, while Type 98 20mm cannons offered close-range protection with an effective ceiling of only 11,500 feet. Against B-29s flying at 30,000 feet, these weapons had proven marginally effective. Against bombers coming in at 5,000 feet in darkness, they would be firing blind. The absence of fire control radar proved catastrophic. American and German anti-aircraft batteries used radar to track aircraft, calculate trajectories, and direct guns with precision. Japanese batteries depended on optical rangefinders and sound locators, equipment that became worthless at night or in poor weather. Gunners aimed at searchlight beams and engine noise, hoping geometry and luck would converge. But the most crippling deficiency was fuel. Japan's oil supplies had been severed by American submarines and the conquest of the Philippines. By early 1945, aviation gasoline had become so scarce that training flights were forbidden. New pilots reached operational squadrons with minimal flight time and virtually no night flying experience. Veteran pilots who understood night intercept tactics were often grounded because their squadrons lacked fuel for combat patrols. Intelligence officers estimated Japan retained perhaps 200 operational fighters in the home islands capable of night operations. Against a single raid of 325 B-29s, this meant roughly 2 fighters for every 3 bombers, assuming all fighters could launch, find targets in darkness, and engage effectively. None of those assumptions would prove correct. Tonight, Tokyo's defenders would face the largest incendiary raid in history, with a broken radar network, grounded fighters, inadequate anti-aircraft coverage, and no fuel reserves. The shield had already shattered. Japan simply didn't know it yet. The M69 incendiary bomblet was not designed to destroy buildings. It was engineered to guarantee they burned. American chemists, engineers, and military planners had spent 2 years developing a weapon tailored specifically to Japanese urban construction. Standard high-explosive bombs created craters and collapsed structures, but fires often burned out before spreading. The M69 solved this problem through deliberate, methodical design that weaponized the physics of combustion. Each bomblet measured 19 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, weighing just 6 pounds. Inside its hexagonal steel casing sat a cloth sleeve soaked in napalm, a jellied gasoline compound that burned at 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit and adhered to any surface it touched. Upon impact, a time delay fuse allowed the bomblet to penetrate through roofs and upper floors before detonating, spraying burning napalm across interior spaces where it would ignite furnishings, tatami mats, and wooden walls. The delivery system multiplied this destructive potential exponentially. The E-46 cluster bomb bundled 38 individual M169 bomblets into a single canister held together by steel bands. At 2,000 feet altitude, the canister burst open, scattering bomblets across a football field-sized area. Each B-29 carried 40 cluster bombs, containing 1,120 individual incendiary bomblets, enough to saturate multiple city blocks with fire. American Fire Research Laboratories had tested these weapons on replicas of Japanese residential districts built at Dugway Proving Ground in Utah. Engineers studied traditional Japanese construction techniques: wooden frames, paper shoji screens, tatami floor mats, and tile roofs supported by wooden beams. They measured how napalm penetrated these materials, calculated burn rates, and determined optimal dispersal patterns. The results were devastatingly precise. M69 bomblets punched through tile roofs and lodged in ceilings or upper floors before igniting. The napalm spray ignited everything combustible within a 15-foot radius. Because Japanese homes featured minimal fire-resistant materials and maximum airflow for ventilation, flames spread with horrifying speed. Families sleeping on tatami mats found themselves surrounded by fire within seconds, with shoji screens providing no barrier and wooden escape routes already engulfed. The weapon's design exploited another lethal factor: oxygen consumption. Napalm fires burned so intensely they depleted oxygen in enclosed spaces, suffocating occupants before flames ever reached them. Families huddling in supposed safe rooms died of asphyxiation as fires raged outside, consuming the air they needed to breathe. Fire marshals and civil defense planners had calculated that Tokyo's narrow streets, often just 12 feet wide, would channel flames between buildings, creating cascading ignition as burning homes ignited adjacent structures. Fire breaks were virtually non-existent in working-class districts where homes stood wall-to-wall for entire city blocks. The M69 represented industrial-age warfare in its purest form, a scientifically optimized weapon designed not for a battlefield but for residential neighborhoods, calibrated specifically to burn wooden homes, engineered to kill civilians. Tonight, 325 B-29s would drop approximately 496,000 of these bomblets across 12 square miles of Tokyo. The city had been designed to house families. America had designed a weapon to burn them. At 12:08 a.m. on March 10, 1945, Pathfinder B-29s arrived over Tokyo's Shitamachi district and released their cargo. Brilliant magnesium flares tumbled through the darkness, igniting at 2,000 feet and burning with an intensity visible from 50 miles away. The lead aircraft dropped their markers in a precise pattern, a massive burning X that marked the exact center of the target area. Each flare burned for several minutes, casting an eerie white glow across the sleeping city below and providing an unmistakable aiming point for the 325 bombers following behind. Tokyo's air raid sirens wailed too late. By the time civil defense networks detected the initial aircraft, the Pathfinders had already completed their marking runs and banked away into the darkness. Below, 750,000 people stirred from sleep, confused by the late-hour alarm. Previous B-29 raids had come during daylight. Night attacks were rare and usually scattered. Most residents assumed this would be another minor incident. A few bombs, some fires, nothing the neighborhood fire brigades couldn't handle. They had 90 seconds before the first cluster bombs fell. The main bomber force approached in waves, aircraft separated by mere minutes rather than the tight formations used in daylight raids. Each pilot lined up on the burning X, verified altitude at 5,000 to 7,000 feet, and released their bomb bay doors. The modified bomb sights required minimal precision. The target was 12 square miles of wooden construction, impossible to miss. At 12:15 a.m., the first E-46 cluster canisters tumbled from the lead bomber's bays. The canisters descended in eerie silence until reaching 2,000 feet, where explosive charges detonated and steel bands snapped apart. Each canister burst open like a lethal seed pod, scattering 38 M69 incendiary bomblets across a 100-yard swath. The bomblets rained down across residential blocks, where families huddled in confusion. Thousands of hexagonal cylinders punched through tile roofs with sharp cracks, penetrating into homes, shops, and workshops. For 3 seconds, nothing happened, just the sound of impacts and confused shouting in the darkness. Then the time delay fuses triggered. Entire city blocks ignited simultaneously. White-hot napalm spray erupted inside hundreds of homes at once, igniting tatami mats, wooden walls, paper screens, and furniture. The jellied gasoline stuck to every surface, burning at 1,800 degrees and spreading with liquid efficiency across floors and ceilings. Families scrambling toward exits found their escape routes already engulfed, flames spreading faster than people could run. Within 2 minutes of the first impacts, fires burned in a dozen neighborhoods simultaneously. Within 5 minutes, individual fires began merging into larger conflagrations. Wooden homes, sharing walls, transmitted flames from structure to structure like a fuse burning across the district. More bombers arrived overhead every 30 seconds, each releasing 1,020 additional bomblets. The mathematical progression was inexorable: 40 cluster bombs per aircraft, 38 bomblets per cluster, multiplied by 325 bombers over the course of 3 hours. Tokyo wasn't being bombed. It was being systematically ignited block by block until the entire district burned as one. By 1:00 a.m., individual fires had merged into a phenomenon that defied all civil defense planning: a firestorm. The physics were brutal and inevitable. Thousands of separate fires burning simultaneously created a massive column of superheated air rising rapidly into the night sky. As hot air rushed upward, cooler air from surrounding areas raced inward to replace it, creating winds that began at 20 miles per hour and accelerated with each passing minute. The incoming air fed oxygen to the flames, intensifying the heat, which drew in more air, which fed more oxygen, creating a self-sustaining thermal hurricane. Within 30 minutes, wind speeds reached 70 miles per hour, then higher. Survivors later described a sound like a massive freight train, or a continuous thunderclap that drowned out screams, explosions, and collapsing buildings. The firestorm was roaring. Ground temperatures exceeded 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass, vaporize wood, and ignite clothing on people hundreds of feet from visible flames. The superheated air itself became a weapon, searing lungs and cooking flesh, even in areas not yet touched by fire. People running through streets collapsed not from flames, but from inhaling air hot enough to destroy respiratory tissue. The Sumida River, which should have provided refuge, became a death trap. Thousands of civilians fled toward the water seeking escape from the advancing flames. They plunged into canals and rivers, submerging themselves to avoid the heat. But the firestorm heated water surfaces to near-boiling temperatures. People who entered the water to survive were scalded. Those who tried to hold their breath underwater eventually surfaced into superheated air that killed them instantly. By dawn, the Sumida River was clogged with bodies. Some burned, some drowned, some boiled alive. Tokyo's fire brigades mobilized with desperate courage and zero effectiveness. Firefighters who reached burning districts discovered their equipment useless against the scale of destruction. Water pressure failed as mains ruptured from heat and bomb damage. Hand pumps and bucket brigades meant nothing against walls of flame advancing faster than men could run. Fire trucks became coffins as crews were overtaken by the firestorm. Their vehicles found days later with charred remains still at the controls. The earthen and concrete shelters built throughout residential districts, structures designed to protect civilians during air raids, became ovens. Families huddled inside as temperatures climbed beyond human tolerance. The shelters had no ventilation systems adequate for a firestorm. Oxygen levels dropped as fires consumed the air outside. Inside the sealed chambers, people suffocated in darkness, dying from hypoxia before flames ever reached them. Rescue workers would later find shelters packed with bodies showing no burn marks, entire families killed by an atmosphere that had simply run out of breathable air. By 2:00 a.m., the firestorm had become a force of nature that burned independent of the bombs still falling. The Shitamachi district wasn't being destroyed anymore. It was being erased. 15 square miles of urban landscape transformed into a single roaring furnace where nothing organic could survive and where the laws of conventional firefighting had ceased to apply. At 7,000 feet, B-29 crews witnessed something no bomber crews had ever seen before. The first wave pilots had released their incendiaries over a darkened city with scattered streetlights and the occasional flicker of earlier fires. They banked away into darkness and began the long flight back to the Marianas. But crews arriving in the second and third waves, aircraft that reached Tokyo between 1:00 and 3:00 a.m., encountered a vision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Tokyo was no longer a city. It had become a sea of fire. Pilots reported seeing the glow on the horizon from 150 miles away, a dull orange luminescence that grew brighter as they approached, eventually becoming so intense it hurt to look at directly. Navigator Robert Morgan later described it as flying toward a sunset at midnight, an impossible sight that violated every expectation of what darkness should look like. As bombers entered their attack runs, crews stared down at an inferno that stretched across the entire visible landscape. Individual fires had ceased to exist. The Shitamachi district burned as a single cohesive mass, 15 square miles of flame creating a light so bright that bombardiers could read their instruments without cockpit lighting. The burning X markers dropped by Pathfinder aircraft had become irrelevant. The target was impossible to miss because the target was everything below them that wasn't already ash. The thermal column rising from the firestorm buffeted aircraft, with turbulence violent enough to throw crewmen against bulkheads. Pilots fought controls as their B-29s were tossed upward by superheated air, then dropped in sickening plunges as they passed through thermal boundaries. Several aircraft reported altitude gains of 2,000 feet in seconds from the sheer force of rising heat, the atmospheric equivalent of hitting a solid wall. Then came the smell. B-29s flew with pressurized cabins, sealed systems designed to protect crews from the thin, freezing air at high altitude. But the air intake systems drew from outside, and despite filters and pressurization, the smell penetrated. Crews reported the odor of burning wood first, charcoal and ash, familiar scents made overwhelming by concentration. Then came something else, something worse. The smell of burning flesh. Pilots and bombardiers caught it in their oxygen masks, a sweet, sickly odor that couldn't be mistaken for anything else. Some crews vomited into their masks, others tried breathing through their mouths, but taste and smell are linked, and the knowledge of what they were tasting made it worse. Radio chatter went silent as grown men confronted the reality that they were flying through smoke composed partially of human remains. Tail gunner James Krantz later recorded in his diary, "We were breathing Tokyo. The city wasn't just burning below us, it was in the air, in our lungs, on our skin. We could taste the death we were causing." Several crews requested permission to abort their bombing runs. Permission was denied. They dropped their payloads and turned for home, knowing they would never forget what they had seen or smelled. Dawn broke over Tokyo on March 10, 1945, revealing a landscape that no longer resembled a city. The firestorm had burned itself out around 5:00 a.m., having consumed everything combustible across 15 square miles of the Shitamachi district. What remained was a flat expanse of ash, twisted metal, and charred debris that stretched to the horizon. Smoke rose in lazy columns from thousands of points where materials still smoldered. The air hung thick with particulates that turned sunlight a sickly orange and made breathing painful. The human cost exceeded comprehension. Initial casualty estimates proved catastrophically conservative. As rescue workers, civil defense teams, and military units entered the devastated zone throughout the morning, the scale of death became apparent. Bodies lay in the streets, some burned beyond recognition, others appearing strangely unmarked but killed by heat or suffocation. The Sumida River had become a mass grave, its surface covered with floating corpses extending for miles. Shelters that should have protected families instead entombed them, earthen chambers packed with suffocated dead. By nightfall, Japanese authorities estimated over 100,000 civilians had died. More than Hiroshima or Nagasaki would kill 5 months later. The true number would never be known. Entire families had been vaporized in the firestorm's peak intensity, leaving no remains to count. Many victims had been cremated where they fell, reduced to ash, indistinguishable from the ash of their homes. 1 million people were homeless. Survivors wandered through the ruins searching for family members, recognizable landmarks, anything familiar. They found nothing. The firestorm had erased not just buildings, but the geography of neighborhoods. Streets existed only as theoretical paths through rubble. Wells and water pumps had melted. Public buildings that might have served as shelters were gone. The physical destruction defied military precedent. Japanese officials documented 267,171 buildings destroyed. Roughly 25% of Tokyo's total structures eliminated in a single night. The Shitamachi district, which had housed 750,000 people the previous evening, had ceased to exist as a functioning community. But the strategic impact cut deeper than infrastructure. The destroyed district had contained thousands of small workshops and cottage industries that manufactured components for Japan's war machine, precision parts, electrical assemblies, textiles, and metal goods. These operations, too dispersed and small-scale to target individually, had now been eliminated wholesale. Supply chains fractured. Production quotas became impossible. War materiel that depended on Shitamachi workshops would never be built. Reconnaissance photographs taken later that day showed what American planners had achieved: a zone of absolute destruction, boundaries clearly defined where incendiaries had saturated their target area. Beyond those boundaries, Tokyo remained largely intact. Within them, nothing survived. Japan's government maintained public silence for 3 days, censoring newspapers and forbidding radio broadcasts about the raid's magnitude. Officials feared that acknowledging the truth would shatter civilian morale completely. They were correct to be afraid. When news finally spread, the psychological impact equaled the physical destruction. Tokyo, the sacred capital, the emperor's city, the heart of the empire, had been burned to ash in 6 hours by an enemy flying machines Japan could neither stop nor retaliate against. The shield had broken, the sword had shattered, and America had 324 more B-29s ready to fly. Within the Imperial General Headquarters, the mathematics of national survival became unavoidable. Japanese military and civilian leaders gathered in emergency sessions throughout March 10th and 11th, reviewing reconnaissance reports, casualty figures, and strategic assessments. The numbers presented a reality that ideology and martial spirit could no longer obscure. If America repeated the Tokyo raid against 10 more cities, Japan would cease to function as a modern nation. The calculation was grimly simple. Tokyo's raid had eliminated 267,171 buildings, killed over 100,000 civilians, displaced 1 million more, and destroyed countless small-scale industries. Japan possessed perhaps 60 cities, with populations exceeding 100,000, all constructed primarily of wood, all vulnerable to incendiary attack, all essentially defenseless against low-altitude night bombing. American industrial capacity could sustain these raids indefinitely. Intelligence officers reported that B-29 production continued at over 4 aircraft per day. The Marianas bases could launch 300 bomber raids weekly without straining logistics. Each raid consumed incendiaries that American factories replaced faster than Japan could repair the damage. The empire faced an enemy that manufactured destruction faster than Japan could rebuild. Fuel shortages made retaliation impossible. Japan's remaining aircraft sat grounded, their tanks empty, while American bombers operated from island bases beyond the reach of Japanese strikes. The Imperial Navy, once the terror of the Pacific, had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in ports, conserved for a final suicidal defense against invasion. Even if Japan possessed the will to counterattack, it lacked the gasoline to launch the aircraft or fuel the ships. Army Minister Korochika Anami articulated what few dared speak openly. "We cannot defend our cities. We cannot strike American bases. We cannot produce war material faster than it is destroyed. We can only decide how many more Japanese civilians will die before we acknowledge what has already been decided." The March 9th raid had demonstrated a fundamental shift in warfare's nature. Traditional military strength, tactical brilliance, warrior spirit, defensive fortifications meant nothing against an industrial power that could burn cities from altitudes Japan's fighters couldn't reach, using weapons Japan couldn't counter, delivered by bombers Japan couldn't shoot down in sufficient numbers. Intelligence reports confirmed American intentions. Curtis LeMay had already scheduled follow-up incendiary raids against Nagoya, Osaka, and Kobe. Reconnaissance flights over other major cities suggested systematic targeting. American planners were methodically selecting which Japanese urban centers would burn next. This wasn't random destruction. It was industrialized annihilation, executed with the same efficiency American factories produced bombers. Some officials clung to delusion, arguing that Japanese spirit would overcome material disadvantage, that divine wind would protect the homeland, that America would exhaust itself before Japan surrendered. But most understood the truth that reconnaissance photos made undeniable. Tokyo had burned in 6 hours. Japan possessed perhaps 60 cities vulnerable to identical raids. America possessed over 2,000 B-29s and the industrial capacity to build more. The arithmetic was inescapable. Continuation meant extinction. Not military defeat, but the systematic erasure of Japanese urban civilization, one firestorm at a time, until nothing remained but ash and the memory of cities that once existed. The war was unwinnable. It had always been unwinnable. Tokyo's firestorm had simply made the truth impossible to ignore. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9–10, 1945, remains one of history's most controversial military actions. Historians continue debating whether the raid constituted a legitimate act of war or a war crime of unprecedented scale. The numbers resist moral certainty. 100,000 civilians dead in 6 hours, nearly all of them non-combatants, women, children, elderly, incinerated in a deliberate attack on residential districts. Yet those same historians acknowledge the context. A total war where Japan's government had mobilized its entire civilian population for military production, where cottage industries throughout residential areas manufactured war materiel, where the alternative to bombing was a ground invasion projected to cost millions of lives on both sides. Curtis LeMay himself never escaped the moral weight of his decision. Years later, he stated with characteristic bluntness, "I suppose if I had lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." He acknowledged that killing 100,000 civilians in a single night violated every conventional understanding of proportionate military force. But LeMay also maintained that his raids shortened the war, saved Allied lives, and ultimately saved Japanese lives by making invasion unnecessary. The survivors carried different truths. Those who lived through the firestorm, the minority who escaped Shitamachi's inferno, described not a military operation but an apocalypse. They remembered the sky falling in fire, remembered canals boiling, remembered streets becoming rivers of flame, remembered the sound of the firestorm drowning out human screams. Survivor Masaharu Otake, 8 years old that night, recalled, "The sky wasn't dark anymore. It was red and orange and filled with embers like snowflakes made of fire. Everything beautiful became terrible." These testimonies resist strategic justification. The experience of running through burning streets, of watching family members consumed by flames, of suffocating in shelters that became ovens. These memories acknowledge no military calculus. For survivors, Tokyo's firebombing exists not as a tactical decision, but as personal trauma, collectively experienced by hundreds of thousands who lost homes, families, and the world they had known. The raid's true significance lies in what it foreshadowed. Tokyo demonstrated that modern warfare had transcended traditional battlefields entirely. The distinction between military and civilian targets had collapsed. Cities themselves had become weapons, or targets, in a conflict where victory demanded not just defeating enemy armies, but destroying the industrial capacity to wage war, even when that capacity existed in residential districts among civilian populations. 5 months later, atomic bombs would devastate Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing fewer people in each attack than died in Tokyo, but doing so instantaneously rather than over 6 hours. The nuclear attacks are remembered as watershed moments in military history, yet Tokyo established the precedent. Total war meant targeting cities, accepting mass civilian casualties, and using scientific advances to maximize destruction. The firestorm over Tokyo wasn't an aberration, it was the template. On March 9, 1945, fire became strategy. Civilians became acceptable losses, and modern warfare crossed a threshold from which it would never return. The sky had fallen, and humanity had learned that it could make the sky fall again, anywhere, anytime, for reasons that history would debate but never resolve.